Hello, everyone. This is the Insert Title Show, and I'm your host, Wolf Strife. Today is the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Ligny and Quatre Bras. And the Battle of Ligny was Napoleon's last victory. It was, Napoleon's Armée du Nord against the Prussian army led by Gebhard von Blücher. He was a pretty old guy. I think he was like in his 70s at the time of the battle, but he had been fighting since, 1770s, I think. So he was a very tough old bastard, and he had fought Napoleon a number of times. So he and Napoleon definitely had some history together. But I guess I'll go into how this all came about. Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba in 1814 after he abdicated the throne, basically after he had gambled all and lost all. But in, I think it was late February, early March 1815, he escaped from the island of Elba and landed back in France. And from there, he marched all the way up to Paris and was reproclaimed Emperor of France, or I guess head of France again. So that was pretty badass that he was able to do that. And of course, all the European powers were freaked out by this and immediately declared Napoleon the outlaw and declared war on him, not on France, because technically France, in their opinion, was still ruled by Louis XVIII, who they put in charge after they got rid of Napoleon. So they really just declared war on Napoleon. So Napoleon knew he had to act fast because each European power promised each other that they would raise an army of 150,000 men. So he knew he had to haul ass to beat them to it, because pretty soon he was going to have Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain pretty much pounding on France's door with shitload of soldiers pretty soon. So he knew he had to act fast and raise his army, which he did. He raised an army of 125,000 men. He was having conscripts assembled so that pretty soon he would have a couple of 100,000 men. But his real army at the time was the Army of the North, Armée du Nord. And with that army, he set off to invade Belgium because through his scouts and I guess his spy networks, he found out that the British army and the Prussian army were separated by, can't remember the distance, but a pretty good margin, like 30, 40 miles in Belgium. They were separated from each other. So he knew if he could go up there and split them and keep them divided, that then he could defeat each army in turn. And if he could knock out those two armies, well, then all he would have left to deal with was the Russian army and the Austrian army. So he crossed the border into Belgium and was able to separate the two armies. And his plan was at the Battle of Ligny to destroy the Prussian army, and at Quatre Bras to keep the British army from intervening. He basically gave command of the Battle of Quatre Bras to his Marshal Ney, who Napoleon had nicknamed the bravest of the brave during the Russian campaign. And supposedly Ney was the last Frenchman to leave Russia, so that's pretty big, pretty badass guy. But Ney was pretty ineffectual during the Waterloo campaign as a whole, and he had a pretty large numerical superiority over the British and their allies. Yeah, basically the British Army, or the Army of the Low Countries as it was called, only of the 120,000 man army, it only had about 30,000 British soldiers, and these were, damn good soldiers, some of the best in the world. I mean, they had kicked the French's asses in Spain and Portugal for the last, like, 8 or 9 years. So these guys were tough. Unfortunately for Wellington, the War of 1812 broke out, and so England had to ship a couple of these units off to fight America, in which they did, most famously at the Battle of New Orleans, where they kind of got their asses kicked. So he was missing a few thousand men because of that. The rest of the army was mainly comprised of Belgians, Dutch, Nassau, Brunswickers, not really top of the line. In fact, the Belgians really only spoke French and had fought for Napoleon for a number of years, so Wellington definitely did not trust these soldiers too much. But his British soldiers he knew were tough, especially the infantry. The cavalry were the freshest cavalry in Europe, because you gotta remember the French cavalry has been fighting for like 20 years. It takes a long time to train a war horse, So even though the French cavalrymen themselves were, I think, the best and easily most experienced in Europe, their horses, on the other hand, were not that great. So the British definitely had an advantage there. So Wellington, in command of the Army of the Low Countries, was trying to meet up with the Prussians, and Quatre Bras. The reason why it's important is because it's the only road in the area that would let any army go east to west. So Napoleon's attacking up the Charleroi-Brussels Road, which goes south to north, and Quatre Bras goes west to east. So naturally, it's very, very important. So if Wellington can keep control of Quatre Bras, then he can link up with the Prussians. So that's why Napoleon sent Marshal Ney to take Quatre Bras. So with Ney hopefully holding Quatre Bras, then Napoleon can attack the Prussians and destroy them. Now the Prussian army at this time is really pretty shitty. Most of I think about 1/3 of it's made up of Landwehr, which is basically militia. So these are like college kids and schoolboys who are like, oh, Napoleon escaped from exile, let's join the army. They would just put into the Landwehr. So these guys weren't going to do a whole lot. And I think the Prussians were also kind of revamping their cavalry and artillery. So this was really an army that was being remade at the time. And in fact, a lot of Blucher's generals and aides-de-camp and stuff would actually go on to create a very good Prussian army many decades after this. And that army would eventually, be the Prussian army that united Germany and gave birth to the German Empire. So, he had like von Clausewitz and Genesue and all these guys who would go on to be very, very big figures in German military history. But for right now, their army is a piece of shit. So the Battle of Ligny, which began on June 16th, was a pretty big affair. I mean, I think Napoleon had about 60,000 men, the Prussians about 80,000. And Napoleon's plan was for Ney, a couple of miles to the west, to take Quatre Bras. And then once he's driven off the British, to swing east and come around the Prussian army and to surround it and together destroy the Prussian army. And if they had done that, Wellington would have had no choice but to get the hell out of mainland Europe, most likely. Napoleon would have marched north, taken Brussels, the capital of Belgium, maybe even taken the Netherlands, and then, gotten a lot of Belgian and Dutch troops to join his army. Then marched south, and he would have met up with his conscripts and had a decent-sized army, probably well over 300,000 men, to confront the Austrians and the Russians. So would have been a pretty big deal if he had been able to destroy the Prussian army. But the problems began pretty early for Ney. Ney was the French generals who had their asses kicked by Wellington in Spain were pretty wary of him, because Wellington would like to, his favorite tactic would be to use a reverse slope, which basically means to find a hill or a ridge and place his soldiers on the other side of it so the army that's attacking can't see the enemy that he's attacking, and his artillery therefore can't really do a whole lot. I mean, the French howitzers can fire over the hill, but that's not as effective as just using, direct fire, just pound the enemy. And I guess I'll talk about artillery for a little bit. Basically, the French artillery is made up of 6-pounders and 12-pounders. That's the weight of the rounds used. So basically, picture the 6-pounder firing a 6-pound solid iron ball, the 12-pounder firing a 12-pound iron ball. Now, the tactic for using these is to basically bounce the ball into the enemy soldiers. If any of you have seen the movie The Patriot, you kind of know what I'm talking about. You're basically playing bowling with solid iron balls. You're trying to hit the soldiers who, march like bowling pins, kind of. You're just trying to knock them over, just tear them to pieces. Knock heads off, knock limbs off, disembowel, go right through them. I think I read in Bernard Cornwell's Waterloo book that one solid cannonball killed like 23 soldiers at the Battle of Waterloo. I guess somebody wrote about seeing a single cannonball do that. Just one guy after the other. So pretty rough. And howitzers, much like today, fired exploding shells. Basically, you'd have a hollow iron ball, and inside would be a bunch of gunpowder, and then you'd stick a fuse in there. When you fired it, the fuse would ignite and slowly burn as the cannonball is flying through the air. Then when it hits the ground, kind of goes nuts, sputtering, then goes boom, sending the outer shell flying everywhere. Exactly how grenades work nowadays with fragmentation and stuff. You're just sending the outer casing flying everywhere. It's pretty nasty. And for close-up work, you had canister, which was basically a can filled with musket balls, and it would turn your cannon into a big-ass shotgun. Very nasty, very effective too. I mean, you can only imagine having to attack an artillery battery and just having to eat that shit the entire time, the entire way. So just, you'd lose. I mean, you would lose on average dozens, if not hundreds, of men attacking an artillery battery. So pretty nasty. And a new artillery round developed by the British, invented by can't remember his rank. I think he was a captain or a lieutenant colonel. His last name was Shrapnel, which is where we get the word shrapnel. He invented case shot. Case shot is basically like the howitzer round, the exploding shell, except he filled it with musket balls, and the fuse was intentionally designed to explode over soldiers' heads, so that would just litter an entire area with musket balls. And when done right, this was very effective, but you had to have a good guy on the fuse, to cut the fuse to the right length. And that's kind of where that kind of artillery got started, and that's why in World War I they had to bring back metal helmets, because shrapnel was exploding over soldiers' heads and just, in the trenches and stuff, and just littering them with all that shit. So that's why they had to bring the helmets back. But they didn't really, case shot wasn't really a big enough issue at this time to necessitate steel helmets, so rock on. So basically you could fire shells over the hill, but that's not going to be as effective. So it was a very ingenious defensive tactic that Wellington used. So Ney was naturally pretty wary of just sending his soldiers over a hill. You don't know what's over that hill. It could be the entire army of the Low Countries. So in the morning of the 16th, Ney had pretty big numerical superiority. He had the second corps and the first corps, so altogether that's about 40,000 men. The British, who were running to the field, only had about 8,000 men there to start off with. So if Ney had attacked in the morning, he would have taken Quatre Bras and probably would have had enough men to hold it. And then he could have marched east to help Napoleon at Ligny. But he was kind of weary and did not attack in the morning. So that was a pretty big blow. And then I believe before the battle at Quatre Bras began, Napoleon sent orders to the First Corps, which I think was the biggest corps in the French army, to start marching east to get behind the Prussian army. So the First Corps, commanded by what was his name, d'Orléans, I believe, started marching east. So that just cut Ney's army in half. So he wasn't too happy about that. So that was a pretty big battle that got going. So well, the battlefield of Ligny was kind of weird. A lot of creeks, a lot of brush, a lot of trees, a lot of little villages, and a very, very weird battlefield. And before the battle began, Wellington actually rode all the way to the battlefield at Ligny to discuss the plans with Blücher. And Blücher said, "Hey, can you come to my help?" And Wellington said, I will if I'm not attacked." And so Wellington rode off west to, get ready to try and push Ney away from Quatre Bras so that Wellington could come and help Blücher. But of course, Ney eventually did attack in the afternoon, but that was a little late. But at least it would keep Wellington from coming to Blücher's aid. And Quatre Bras would be a little bit of a bloodbath here and there, back and forth, slug match, back and forth here and there. But I think there would only end up being about 8,000 casualties for combined casualties for both sides. So I think Ney lost about 4,000 men and Wellington about 4,800. So it wasn't that big of a deal. But it did. But Ney definitely did succeed in keeping Wellington from coming to Blücher's aid. But you could say the same thing for Wellington, keeping Ney from coming to Napoleon's aid. So it's kind of a draw, I guess. But the Battle of Ligny began at about 2:30 in the afternoon when he heard cannon fire coming from Quatre Bras. Thus, he knew, his left flank was in action. So that's when he began his attack with the Fourth Corps under General Gerard. And they started off by attacking some of the villages and stuff. And it was rough fighting, man. You're having to march an army through brush, and Prussian artillery was hitting the French columns pretty well. But one of the things that Wellington said that morning when he was talking to Blücher, he was looking at the battlefield and he was like, if you take your Prussian soldiers and hide them behind that ridge, they will be pretty well off and pretty well defended against French artillery. And the Prussian and Blücher kind of looked at him like, "Bitch, please don't tell me what to do." So Wellington failed in trying to get the Prussians to adopt his reverse slope tactic. So naturally, the Prussians were just kind of in the wide open. So the French artillery had a fun time just blowing those guys to hell. So when the French infantry did attack, they were quite successful in pushing the Prussians back. And the Prussians would counterattack, and it was just kind of going back and forth here and there. But this was okay because Napoleon's strategy was for his left flank, Ney, the First and Second Corps, to get the job done at Quatre Bras and come over here and surround the Prussians and destroy them. Well, little did Napoleon know was that Ney did not have control of Quatre Bras, therefore he did not have control of the west to east road. So Ney would be not really able to. Ney would not really be able to come to his aid with the Second Corps, but the First Corps was able to move a little further east and hop on that road. But the problem with the First Corps was when it was in mid-March, and actually Napoleon saw this happen. He saw the First Corps coming a couple of miles away. He was like, all right, we're kind of kicking the Prussians' asses here, but we're not quite able to destroy them. But okay, the First Corps is coming, so all right. But unfortunately for the French, Ney, when he was engaged with Wellington soldiers, figured that he needed help. So he sent orders to the First Corps, de Hollande, to come to his aid. So de Hollande was kind of in a pickle here because he was technically under Ney's command because, they're on the left flank. They're in the west. They're in the west fighting at Quatre Bras. So he was technically under Ney's command, but Napoleon just sent him orders a couple hours ago to come east. So he's kind of like, what do I do? And unfortunately, he decided to listen to Ney, so he had to turn his entire corps of about 18,000 soldiers around, which you can imagine being strung out over miles. This would take a while. So to Napoleon's absolute horror, I'm sure, you saw the First Corps turning around and going west when it was like just a mile or two away from coming around the Prussian army. So naturally, he sent orders immediately to de Hollande to, what are you doing? Keep going east. So unfortunately, the First Corps was strung out. It was turning around. Then it just got orders to immediately turn back around. So the First Corps ended up not getting engaged at all on the 16th. So it was basically just left in the middle of the two armies not doing anything. So it couldn't help Ney out and it couldn't help Napoleon out. So that was just a huge snafu foobar sandwich. I mean, it was just a nightmare what happened with the First Corps. And I absolutely believe if the First Corps had been able to either knock Wellington off of Quatre Bras, then maybe the First and Second Corps could have come to Napoleon's aid. Or at the very least, if it had been able to attack the Prussians from their right and their rear, I mean, that would have destroyed the Prussian army for the most part. So unfortunately, that didn't happen. And now the Prussians were counterattacking pretty well, and you got to remember they outnumbered the French here by about 15 to 20,000 men. So this was, kind of serious. But luckily for the French, they had a much better army. So Napoleon had with him the Third Corps, the Fourth Corps, and his Imperial Guard. Now the Imperial Guard is made up of infantry, mainly made up of infantry and cavalry. You got the Young Guard, who are basically the best soldiers at the time, like the new guys, basically, the best of the new guys. The Middle Guard are the best of the soldiers from about 5 to 10 years ago. And the Old Guard, who are the best of the best. I mean, some of these guys have been with Napoleon for like 20 years or so. So, I mean, these guys were the best of the best. And then you have the Imperial Guard Heavy Cavalry, which is made up of the Grenadiers et Cheval de la Garde Impériale, who were basically Grenadier Heavy Cavalry. And they had never been defeated in battle, just like the Imperial Guard Infantry had never been defeated in battle. And you had the Emperor's Dragoons, who were tough. Well, they're in the Imperial Guard, so they're definitely elite. And then you have the Imperial Guard Light Cavalry, which were made up of the Red and Polish Lancers, and the Invincibles, who were pretty good light cavalry. And I believe it was either the Polish or the Red Lancers also were never defeated in battle. But as far as the Imperial Guard infantry goes, basically you have Grenadiers and Chasseurs. Grenadiers you could tell who they were because they had brass plates on their big bear skin helmets, and the Chasseurs didn't. So that was basically the only difference, really, between the two. And the Young Guard were made up of basically regular line infantry and light infantry, so they were a little more versatile. Basically, the job of the grenadiers and chasseurs was to be Napoleon's coup de grace, just the freaking final blow that would destroy an enemy's army, and they had always succeeded at doing that. So, with the First Corps out there just floundering around, Napoleon realized that, all right, basically all I can do now is to try and knock out the Prussian army. Can't destroy it, but I can maybe damage it enough to keep them from being a thorn in our side. And the 6th Corps near this, I guess this was kind of in the late afternoon, the 6th Corps was coming up, which was kind of a small corps. I think about 6,000 to 8,000 men. So now Napoleon's, getting closer to being even, numerically speaking. So at this time, Napoleon decided to, all right, I'm going to move the Imperial Guard artillery up, naturally the best artillery in the world at the time. And we're going to get the Old Guard supported by the Grenadier Cheval de la Garde Impériale. It's a fun thing to say. And the Grenadier Cavalry of the Imperial Guard had a pretty cool nickname. They were called the Gods. So that's pretty cool. So the Old Guard and the Gods got together, and at about 5:45 is when the Imperial Guard artillery opened up on the entire center of the Prussian army. And then with the Gods in support, the Old Guard attacked, blew right through the Prussian center, and battle was won. Blucher tried to lead a cavalry counterattack with 2 brigades of cavalry, and he actually led the charge himself. Not too bad for a guy in the 70s back then, or even today. But his horse was killed and actually fell on top of him, and he was almost captured by the French. But a major threw his cloak over Blucher, hiding his medals and stuff. And they were able to shuttle him off, sneak him back to the Prussian army. So the Prussian army was definitely broken and in full retreat, but luckily for them, the guy who took over command of the Prussian army decided to retreat northeast, not east. Now, if they had retreated east back to Prussia, that would have been the end. There would have been no way in hell they could have ever come to the aid of Wellington. So by marching northeast, they were still kind of close enough that maybe in a day or 2 or 3 they could come and help. But for right now, the Prussians were in retreat. So Napoleon had won, but wasn't quite the decisive victory that he had wanted. So he was pretty pissed off at Ney. In fact, I think he told Ney that you've lost France. Basically saying you've ruined us, by not, 1, taking Quatre Bras, and 2, not helping me destroy the Prussians. So that was a thing to say to the bravest of the brave, Ney. But with Wellington knowing now that the Prussians were in full retreat, he got the hell out of there. He had to keep his army intact to protect Brussels. So he fell back. And that's basically what was going on the 17th. The next day, he was falling back, and the French were following suit. But one of the mistakes that Napoleon made was he split his army. He gave Marshal Grouchy, who was a cavalry commander the previous day, but made a marshal that day. After the Battle of Ligny, he was made a marshal. So he gave Marshal Grouchy 30,000 men, and told to basically keep the Prussians running. The problem for Grouchy was he didn't know where the hell the Prussians were. He didn't know what road they took. They could have gone east, they could have gone north, they could have gone northeast, could have gone anywhere. So that was one of his dilemmas. So with that, Napoleon only had about 70,000 men left to fight the Army of the Low Countries. But the Army of the Low Countries, after their losses and after being spread out all over the place, all over Belgium, they only had about 69,000 men ready to fight on the 18th at the Battle of Waterloo. So I guess on the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, I will discuss that battle. But for today, I hope you enjoyed this lead up to it with the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Ligny and Quatre Bras. So take it easy and check out my Waterloo episode on the 18th.